Hi, I'm Rick Bleiweiss, and I'm here today with Andrew Grant, who also writes under the name Andrew Child. And if you don't know the name Child, you must be living under a rock somewhere because Andrew and his brother Lee Child write the Reacher series, and Andrew writes books on his own. And I'm going to plug this one for a second. This is Bat Out of Hell. It's an anthology of mystery stories based on the Bat Out of the Hell album, although the stories have no relations to the songs other than the titles. And if you look on the cover, what you see is Andrew Child first and Rick Bleiweiss second, and we both have. There's a new Reacher story in there, and there's a Pignon Scorpion prequel, and I am just ecstatic being in the same book with Andrew. So, hi, Andrew.
Well, hi Rick. It's a pleasure to be on the show with you. Thank you so much for inviting me, and also for talking about Bad Out of Hell because it is just I think Don, the series editor, Don Bruns, deserves a huge amount of credit
Yes.
because he did something that hardly anybody has ever been able to figure out how to do, and that is how to have a series of short story anthologies that are related to each other, which is brilliant. And the Bad Out of Hell, as you say, we both have stories in there, and it's just such an honor. The other authors that are involved and the stories that they have come up with, inspired by some of the music, it's just fantastic. It was one of the most satisfying projects that I've ever been involved in, and it's a pleasure to talk about it.
Well, great. I feel the same way, and I've read your story in the book. It's a wonderful Reacher story, and it contains all the elements of a Reacher story, so it really works.
Well, thank you, and same for you because I was fortunate enough to read one of the novels earlier in the series. So any new story is something that I look forward to eagerly.
Well, thank you. Thank you. So I think people can tell from your accent that you may not be native to Wyoming. So I believe you were born in Birmingham, England, and now you're living in Wyoming. And how did that all come about?
Yeah, I mean it's not a very well-trodden path, I don't think, from Birmingham, England to Wyoming. But yeah, it all started as so many stories do. When I met a girl in a bar. It was actually leading. It was actually the first night. Well, I suppose even more accurately than the night before the first night at 𝐬𝐻𝐿𝐵𝐻𝐿𝐿 in Baltimore in 2008. I'd come over to the conference because my first book was about to come. Well, it was coming out the following May, and the organizers, my publishers, my agent, everybody had said to me, "Okay, it's time for you to start going to these events. You got to start meeting people, start getting your name out there, and you're talking about the book and everything." So I came over to Baltimore. Actually, that night my brother was at the conference, so we went for dinner. I remember eating a steak that was like, I think probably half my body weight in that hotel restaurant. And then when we came out, he went outside for a cigarette, and I thought, okay, I've come here to work. I have to do it. I wasn't really looking forward to setting foot into the bar because, I'm from England and we don't generally go up to people and say, "Hi, let me tell you about me." So I was really not looking forward to it. So I thought, what I'll do is I will go to the very far end of the bar because then even if I lose my nerve and I want to try to escape, I'll be bumping into people. I'll at least have to say something to them. So maybe that'll help me. So I took one step into the bar. I'm not sure if you were at that @𝐬𝐻𝐿𝐵𝐻𝐿 or not, Rick, but if
Was
you were, you might remember the bar in that hotel was enormous. It felt like kind of the size of a football field. And it had a bar down one side, it had round tables along the middle, and it had booths at the other side. So I took one step into the bar and I saw this woman standing at a table talking to her friends. And I thought to myself, okay, the plan has changed. Talk to her, but again, what am I going to do? I don't. So I thought, well, I'm in a bar and I don't have a drink. So conferences, it takes ages to get served. I'll order a drink, and while I'm waiting for it to come, I'll think of something. So I went and I ordered a beer. And it came instantly. Basically, it was immediately in my hand. I still hadn't thought of something. And I thought, oh God, what am I going to do? But as I look around, I saw that she was coming over. It was Tasha Alexander, who's now my wife. And we just clicked instantly in that moment. I think it was one of those kind of Zen things in that neither of us was looking for a relationship at that point. We both had decided at that point in our lives probably it was just something that wasn't for us. And yet, not looking for it, somehow we found it. We started talking that night and we have not stopped since. And so, as soon as I could, I moved over to the States and we were living in Chicago for almost 10 years. And we absolutely loved it in Chicago. Chicago is one of my favorite cities. And we were both, at that point we would have said, if you cut us, our blood is going to come out like full of city grime, because we are absolute city people. It's the only thing we've known and it's the only thing we want. And Chicago, world-class city, museums, restaurants, sports, galleries, anything you want, architecture, everything is there. And we had a wonderful, wonderful time. But it got to the point where, we were living in a small apartment in Lincoln Park, which is pretty central. But, we didn't have much space. We both work from home. We're both novelists, so we're on top of each other all the time. It's a very noisy, energetic place. And we just started to think, it's time. The kids were out of the house. They were at university now. We needed somewhere with more space. And finding somewhere in a city like Chicago with more space that you can actually afford is pretty much impossible. So we were kind of in limbo. And Tasha wanted to go on a road trip. She wanted to show me some of the places around the United States that she'd lived in previously. And she said to me, so on this road trip, we're going to stay in Laramie for probably longer, Laramie, Wyoming, a
Mhm.
little longer than most people probably would. But the thing was that she'd moved there after college and had loved Wyoming. She'd loved the open space. She'd loved the mountains. She'd never wanted to leave. So, because it had been a special place for her, she really wanted me to get to see it. And when we arrived, it was like nothing. A lot of people say to me, could you ever imagine yourself living in a place like Wyoming? And the answer is no, because I couldn't even imagine there being a place. Wyoming is larger than the entire United Kingdom, and its
I didn't
and its
realize that.
population, yeah, and its population is 500,000 people. That's the town where I went to college. And so, if we want to see a moose, we look out of the window. If we want to see people, we have to get in the car and drive for 20 minutes. So that sense of space, of freedom, of just peace and tranquility was something I'd never ever experienced before. And so I said to her, we're trying to move out, we're trying to move house anyway. Why don't we move here? And so she instantly went online, started looking for houses that were for sale. We found this one, and everything just fell into place like clockwork.
Wow.
Sometimes if you're trying to move, everything goes wrong and it's a nightmare. This was the opposite. Everything clicked into place, and one of the lovely things about Wyoming being so big and being so unpopulated is that one thing you get a lot of is space. So we went from a really very nice but very small two-bedroom apartment in Chicago to just as much space as you could possibly need. And that was beautiful anyway. We love it. But then, of course, when the pandemic came, it was just, it we really couldn't have landed in a better spot.
Oh, I'm sure. It's interesting. As you can tell from the wall behind me, I spent a portion of my career in the music industry. And my wife was in the music industry. That's where we met. Your wife is an author. That's where you met. And I don't know about your relationship with your wife, but I found that because we were both in the same industry, we had a lot to talk about all the time and shared a lot of common interests. I'm assuming it's pretty much the same with you and Tasha.
It is. It's absolutely the same. Yeah, because not only do we have our job in common, but we both our first love was for both of us was theatre, and so we really had the same weird path. Wanting to be in theatre, that not panning out, so winding up as in a sort of detour through the kind of corporate world when you were trying to wrestle with the logistics of mortgages and all that kind of stuff, and then managing to escape from that again back into a creative world, but ending up in novel writing rather than theatre. So yeah, our paths to this point in our lives have also been extremely similar. And you know what it's like when you're starting a book, when you're first getting to grips with it. I always used to like, and I'm happy about this because this is a kind of retro technology that people used to think I was crazy when I used to talk about this, but now more people get it. You know how if you have an instant camera, like one of those old Polaroids,
Yeah.
you take the picture and the thing comes out of the front of the camera, and at first it's kind of soupy, you can see a few indistinct shapes. But as you watch it, they start to come into focus, and there's a moment when you can't quite tell what they are yet, but you
Right.
can see that
Yeah.
there's a picture there. And I feel that when you're getting there, the first ideas are coming together for a book. That's just what it's like. There's a moment when you can feel that there's a story there, but it's not clear yet. And if you try to describe that to somebody, you sound like a lunatic. It's all incoherent. None of it makes sense. And she gets it. If I start talking like that to her or she does to me, you actually, on each other's behalf, you feel that little, that frisson of excitement because you know that, in a year's time, you'll be holding a book in your hand that is the product of that initial moment. And we love that. We love that. And it means that you can really, understand the frustrations that the other person's going through as well. I've got these really good friends back in England. The wife is a civil servant, the husband is a playwright, and they would have times where, he wouldn't be able to sleep because he was having trouble with the script he was writing. So he would come downstairs and sort of dramatically fling himself onto the couch. And then in due course, she would get up and she would get the kids up and she would get them washed, get them dressed, get them fed, get them out the door, take them to school, go to her job, do that job all day, go and get the kids, bring them home, start making them dinner. And he would still be lying on the couch and he would say, "Oh my God, I've had the worst day." And she would be saying, "Well, let me tell you about having a hard day." But, there are those moments, aren't there, when you're struggling, you're trying to get all of the different elements. It's like trying to knit only the wool of the cord, or it doesn't exist. It's all in your head, and trying to get it to line up and tie it. It can be really difficult and really frustrating, even though it's kind of crazy because it actually doesn't even exist. And so, when we're stuck in those kind of situations, we really know what it's like for the other person.
Oh, totally. Yeah, that's absolutely true.
Yeah.
You and I are in some ways the exact opposites of each other. I'm an American writing a series about an Englishman in Britain, and you are a Brit writing a series about an American. How
Yeah.
difficult was it or not for you to write about an American in America, or was it just a piece of cake?
Well, I think there are two aspects to it. I think one of the aspects is actually really, really helpful. I don't know if you found this as well, but I find that if you're writing kind of through an outsider's eyes, it's
Right.
actually really, really beneficial because I think there are things that, we will each see in the other culture that people who grew up in it probably don't, but not quite as conscious of it because it was just always that way and they've grown up with it. Whereas we're seeing it for the first time and we're thinking, wait a minute, that's a little bit strange. What's going on there? So that aspect of being able to we're living, and looking through an outsider's eyes, that is really, really positive and really, really helpful, I think. But the less helpful, the more difficult part is trying to make your character seem authentically from
The
the other culture. And Lee did something quite clever with Reacher initially in that he made it so that Reacher had grown up on army bases throughout the world. And the first sustained block of time Reacher spent in the United States was when he went to West Point.
right.
So there are ways in which Reacher also, even though he's American, has an aspect of being an outsider to him and has a curiosity about American culture that you get from not having grown up with it all around you 24/7.
Yeah, got it. So I know one of the hallmarks of Reacher is him having no tolerance for bullies and trying to help the underdog, if you will. I think described it as a modern knight errant at times. Um, but I understand you personally feel that as well, and maybe have done that in your life too. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. I mean, this is something that where, Reacher sprang from, sort of Lee's imagination, Lee's subconscious, and the character takes on, the cues, the motivations, the things that, the things that Lee likes, Reacher likes, the things, I mean, it's somewhat exaggerated because, Lee has got more, he owns more than just a toothbrush, but, that idea that you're stripping down to the absolute, Lee takes everything to the extreme. So that, you see that in Reacher with it going to the extreme of the only possession being his toothbrush. So that is absolutely stemming from Lee's personality. And that same thing, the just absolute um, like red mist that descends like when you encounter a bully, somebody who's obnoxious, somebody who thinks he can push somebody else around, and the thing is that in pretty much every way, Lee and I react in the same way. We laugh at the same things, we get mad about the same things. Everything like that is the same for us. So that feeling, that just it's not something that you can switch on or off. It's not
Right.
something that you can control. The closest I can liken it to is the Vikings. They had that thing, the berserkers, these people that
Mhm.
just went completely out of control when faced with something with some kind of injustice or outrage like that. There's nothing you can do about it. You can't decide whether you're going to do it or not. You just have to do it. And there've been times when it has happened over the years, years ago, I remember I was on a train in England. I was heading from Sheffield to Bristol for some work thing. And I wanted to, another thing that we have in common with Reacher is our kind of essential, dependence on coffee. So I was on this train. I needed to go to the buffet car to get some coffee. And as I stood up, I noticed down at the other end of the carriage that there were several other passengers who were men, and they were like sitting with their noses in their newspapers. There was one guy standing up, and he was harassing this woman, and she was saying to him, she was trying to stay calm and trying to, stay collected, and was just being very, very polite and very firm, asking him to leave her alone, and he wouldn't. And none of these other people would do anything. And, I just found myself going down there and saying to the guy, she's asked you to leave her alone. Why haven't you? And
Wow,
he,
good for
so,
you.
and from that, and and so I knew that we were actually very close to Birmingham New Street Station. So I said to him, you've got two choices: leave her alone or get off the train. And he says, "Are you going to make me?" And guess what? He got off the train, face down on the platform. And again, I mean, look when you look back on it, you think, God, what a stupid thing to have done. The guy could have been armed. He could have been but it's baked into us. It's how we're wired, and it comes out in Reacher. Another time I got in trouble. The school I went to was very old, very formal, and back in the day, that it was obviously before email or anything like that. And I remember, so, and at this time in England, there were two deliveries of mail a day, one very early and then one sort of
Right.
mid-morning. And we were sitting having breakfast, and the first delivery of mail arrived, and there was a letter from the school addressed to my dad. So he opens the letter, and he had these really fierce-looking kind of half-moon reading glasses, and he opens the letter and he reads it, and he glares at me over the top of the reading glasses. Now, a couple of things about my dad. One is he's from Northern Ireland, so he has this incredibly harsh Northern Irish accent. And the
Right.
second thing was that he grew up in an entirely different world to us. He landed at Normandy, he fought in World War
Wow.
II, so he had a different approach to a number of things, different to the sort of things that really you can get away with these days. So he reads the letter and he glares at me and he says, Andrew, This letter says you've been fighting. Is it true? So I said, yes, Dad, it is. And do you know what his only question was? Did you win?
It's a good
So I said,
question.
yep. So I said, yes, Dad, I did. So he just screwed the letter up and tossed it in the bin.
That's great.
So, you can see, a lot of Reacher, it stems from our, and again, people often ask us about the military aspect with Reacher. He is his whole personality really is formed by his experience in the military, and neither Lee nor I ever served in the military, but our father did, and the way that our household was regulated, it was entirely around his army experiences. Things like when we were little kids, if we were going if we were driving in the car to our grandparents' house, 2, 3, 4 hours in the car. Any of my friends who were doing that with their families, they could have books in the car to read, they could have toys to play with. We could not, because nothing was allowed into that car that you could not pick up and take with you if you had to abandon the vehicle, because baked into my dad's mentality was that you might have to abandon your vehicle at any moment, so there's not time to be gathering stuff up or pack. You just have to grab it and go. And likewise, if we were going somewhere new that had never been before, he would sit down with the map and he would memorize the route. He would not write it down, because a map or a list of directions, they can be lost, they can be burnt, they can be so unless you have to have the route memorized. And so that's how I grew up. And when you would go, maybe as you got a bit older, you would go on a road trip with a friend, and like their dad is reading a map, and you're like, what's going on here? Why hasn't he memorized it? And so things like that, I think we were just exposed to so much of that kind of stuff. The practicality, anything that we had, any possession. First of all, it had to have a practical purpose. You would have nothing that was just decorative or ornamental. It had to serve a purpose. It had to be maintained properly, and it would not be thrown away until it had completely worn out. And honestly, I think the main reason for Lee deciding that he wanted Reacher, his famous thing of when he will just buy a new set of clothes and throw the old one away,
Right.
that would have made my dad's head explode. The idea. In fact, one of my dad's claims to fame was that he once wore the same pair of trousers for an entire year
Really?
because yeah, after landing in Normandy and and pressing on, they went through Belgium and Holland into Germany. They were always a step ahead of the supply column, so they actually wore the same pair of trousers for a whole year. And so when you're a teenager and it's really important that you have the most fashionable jeans or whatever, and you want new jeans just because the old pair aren't fashionable, he could not comprehend
Wow.
why you would get rid of a pair of perfectly serviceable trousers just because of the way they looked.
Oh, that's very cool.
Yeah.
So, writers can be categorized generally into two camps, plotters and pantsers.
Mm.
Plotters kind of laying out with bullet points and everything that's going to go into their book, and they kind of know beforehand. And then pantsers basically fly by the seat of their pants, and they may have an idea, but it's like whatever the divine thing that happens in your brain that creates a story that you see. Um, and I'm certainly a pantser. I'm not a plotter. And I believe you probably are as well. Is that fairly accurate?
Well, I think it depends on which one of the sort of writing personas, I'm inhabiting at that moment. I
Okay.
would say probably, without wanting to kind of duck the question, I would say that I probably have a foot in both camps because
Okay.
um, when I was writing as Andrew Grant before, joining with my brother for Reacher, I wouldn't say that I was one of the most hardcore plotters, because as you know, there are people who more or less write a novella as the outline, and just embellish it a little bit. Other people have things on their walls, with pieces of string and post-it notes and everything. I was never quite to that extreme, but I did always like to have some idea about where I was going, who the
Okay.
bad guy was, what were they up to, how it was all going to resolve, how it, what the ending was going to be. Um, but Lee never did. He always liked to start off, think of the first sentence when he was happy with it, think of the second. And not to say that he did no planning or no
Sure.
thinking about it. He would stop at, critical moments, think what would happen next, write that, then think what would happen next. And when I started to write with him, my ambition was that I would be able to produce Reacher's books that were kind of indistinguishable from the ones that he had written. I had this sort of bizarre sort of fantasy that what would happen would be it would be launch day. So, somebody would be wanting to buy the new Reacher, so they would race down to they'd finish work and they'd race down to the bookstore, but there was only one copy left. And that copy was all mangled. The bookseller had actually been about to return it because somehow the covers had been ripped off. The bio bits had been ripped off, the also buy bits. All that was left were the pages with the story in. But the guy was so desperate to read the new story that he bought it anyway, went home, and at the end would say, wow, that was just as good as ever, or even, wow, that was even better than before, but without any sense of whether it was just Lee, whether it was both of us, whether it was just me. I wanted the author to be invisible and it just be about the character and the story. And so what I thought, and I don't know if this really makes sense or not, but what I thought was if I'm aiming for the same result, it makes sense to try to create that result in the same way.
Yeah.
So I had to kind of
Process. Yeah.
yeah, so I had to sort of switch off the part of me that was looking for that little bit of extra sort of security of knowing where the story was going, and really just sort of cut the cord and embrace the uncertainty. And it's been a very very interesting process. And I mean, and what I kind of liken it to a little bit was if you imagine instead of being writers, we were contractors. We were builders, and somebody hired us to build something for them. In my first few books, I would at least want to know that they wanted me to build them a house,
Right.
as opposed to an apartment building or a petrol or a gas station.
Right.
Whereas, I got the impression with Lee, he was more or less happy to just pick up the trowel and start cementing blocks together and without any real idea of what he was. And so, I had to kind of move away from that. I want a little bit of guidance. I had to move away to, yeah, whatever, let's just dive in and see what happens. And one sort of side effect of that, and I don't know if you feel this because I know this is how you write, is I think that it adds a kind of confidence to the writing in a way, because if it's a bit like walking a tightrope, if you know there's a safety net there waiting for you,
Right.
you're a little bit worried about falling off, right? It can happen. It doesn't matter because
Right.
the outline is there. Whereas if you know that you have to just press on full speed all the way to the other side, no room for doubt. You have to have that kind of extra degree of confidence. And I think it certainly in Lee's earlier books, I really think that came out. And so I think that is perhaps, everything else is sort of behind the curtain. But I think that is something that does permeate through to the finished product.
Well, cool. I've read that there have been over 100 million Reacher books sold so far, and I'm saying so far because there are obviously going to be many more sold. But what do you attribute that level of success to? What is it that sets that apart from other heroes that don't come close to that?
Well, I think, there's probably two things. One of them, I've got to give my brother credit for just, being a really, really good writer and coming up with a prose style which is really effective. He is he is so methodical. He pays such attention to detail. Every single word is chosen, with extreme care. And it used to drive me crazy when, sometimes you would read, somebody from a kind of literary publication would kind of, deign to dabble, to sully themselves with genre fiction, and they would write a review of a Reacher book, and they would say, Well, it's obviously just genre fiction, but something about it, you start on page one and it just grabs you and it pulls you through and you can't put it down, and finally you get to the end. That's not an accident. That happens because of the way that uses every word, every sentence, every paragraph, every chapter to grab you and keep you moving. So a lot of the credit is down to him. But I think the other part, you actually mentioned it already, which is that Reacher is another, he's the 21st century iteration of the knight errant archetype. And, these archetypal characters, Robin Hood and other things like that, they, in one form or another, with different names, have been around really right back to the first stories humans would tell. You can see them in ancient Greek literature, you can see them in Japan, you can see them in Europe, Scandinavia, the Wild West in the States. They endure because there is something about them which speaks to some kind of need that we all have. And, as you were saying about the archetype, the knight errant archetype, there's three things to it. One is that he arrives in your town. The second is that he fixes your problem. And the third, and sometimes this one is overlooked, but I think this is the most important. The third one is that he then leaves, right? Because imagine if he didn't leave. Imagine what it would be like if, imagine Reacher shows up where you live, he fixes a problem that you've got, and then he buys the house next door. What do you do? Do you have to mow his lawn for him? Do you have to bring him coffee every morning? It totally changes the dynamic. So that idea that, you know, it taps into something universal. We all in our lives have frustrations. We have things that annoy us and irritate us that we can't put right. It could be something to do with a boss at work. It could be someone down the pub. It could be somebody in your sports team. It could be anything, and you can't do anything about it because you'd go to jail or you'd lose your job or it just wouldn't work. And so you turn to fiction. It's kind of escapist, isn't it? It's wish fulfillment. And suddenly this character arrives, and he's simultaneously, he's almost like your hero. He is
Yeah.
he is fixing the problem for you on your behalf. And even though it's only fiction, it's just on the page, it's not in real life. He gets the job done, and for once, something right has prevailed over wrong. Something has, the right outcome has come up, and that is just enormously satisfying. And particularly, as times become more turbulent and more worrying in the wider world, I think you've got even more of a need to take refuge in a fictional world where things will turn out right.
I think I'm dating myself here as opposed to your age, but there used to be a TV show here in America called Paladin. I don't know if
Mhm.
you remember that or not. I think Jack Palance starred in it, but I'm not positive. And that's
Yeah.
what his figure was. It took place in the Old West, and he would come into a town, take care of the bullies, and take off.
Exactly, and that's what you want. Yeah, I think that was, there was a time when I was a kid, we only had at first we had three TV channels, and then eventually four and five, and then satellite and cable came, and what that meant was that a lot of the shows that came over from the States were broadcast in a very kind of haphazard way because with only three channels there wasn't enough time to sort of stake out, this is going to be on at 6 p.m. every
Right.
every Saturday or whatever, so it would just show up whenever they had a space in the schedule that they could put it in. So a lot of those things I do remember them, but it wasn't the kind of thing that you could sort of routinely watch
Right.
because you never knew when it was going to show up.
So there may not be anything, but what have you found to be the hardest thing about writing Reacher?
Well, I think for me, the idea of understanding Reacher as a character, and the idea of coming up with stories that he was part of, those things were they felt very natural because, Lee had written 24 of these books on his own before I got involved. And the very first one that he wrote, I was the first person to read it. He sent it me when it was handwritten in pencil on notepaper. And so, and as we were saying earlier, Reacher, is somebody who's kind of springs from our own sort of subconscious. We understand the character, we know how he will respond to things. So figuring out what Reacher will do was very normal and actually very natural because well, for all of those years, we would sit around, anytime we hung out together, we would be talking about Reacher and we'd be saying, what would Reacher do about this? What would Reacher think about that? We sounded crazy, because it was like he was there with us, but invisible. And the difference really was that now, instead of just talking about it and then going home, now I had to write it down. And that was where the most difficult part came in because I'd written 9 other books before this had happened, and
Right.
I had tried very hard to avoid sounding like my brother. I wanted to kind of carve out my own niche. I wanted anybody who read both of our books to see that there was a difference. And
Right.
so, what I had to do kind of overnight was a kind of 180-degree turn where instead of trying to sound completely different, I wanted it to sound indistinguishable. And that was difficult. That took a while. And I found it a little bit, I mean, being in the music industry, if you see somebody tuning a piano and they kind of tap the string with their little hammer and then
Right.
tweak and tap and it's still not quite right, so and
Right.
it's a certain number of taps and a certain number of tweaks to get it sounding how they liked. That was very much what it was like when I would write a sentence, or a paragraph, and I'd look at it and it'd be like, no, it performs the function that I want in the story, but it doesn't sound right yet. And so I would have to tweak it
Right.
and in the first 2, 3 books we did, that was really time consuming, and I was going over and over and over trying to get it to sound right. And I feel like that part comes a little bit more quickly, a little bit quicker now. So that's encouraging. But yeah, to answer your question, that was the most difficult part, making the capturing the voice, the rhythm, how he combines long sentences with short ones, how that all builds up to give you a momentum that pulls you through the story. That was a difficult part.
Oh, cool. Now, you had mentioned you were the first person to read the first Reacher book. Um, who's your first reader? Is it Tasha or is it Lee or is it someone else?
It is. No, it's Tasha always, and but for at least two very good reasons. One is, as you know, when you've been working on a novel, it takes a long time to write a novel. You're deeply immersed in it. You're very very close to it. It's really difficult to evaluate whether it's any good or not. You don't know whether by sending that to your editor, you're actually committing career suicide or whether it's going to be okay. And so having somebody that you can trust 100% to read the thing and say, yeah, it's fine, or no, set fire to it and leave the country, that is really, really useful. And the other thing is, we were talking earlier about, the differences of being, English but writing about an American character. My first couple of novels, they were set in America because I wanted that, America was the kind of the scene that I wanted. That was the background. But I wasn't quite confident enough at that point because I was still living in England when I wrote the first one to make the character American. And I've kind of, I've got to the point now where I'm happy to give it a shot, but then having someone who is American who can read it and just little odds and ends, little words, little sentences, little phrases that I think are perfectly normal, she will pick up on and say, an American wouldn't say this, they wouldn't say that. And just odd things, completely unexpected when I started out. I hadn't appreciated initially that Americans are actually much more grammatically correct than English people.
Really?
And so, Yeah, in strange, unexpected ways. So, there would be, when you get through to that copy editing phase, and suddenly, your whole manuscript is covered in red, things like that. And I've learned that now, and I've learned to kind of switch into a more precise mode for certain aspects, not every aspect of grammar, but certain ones, so as to so as to speed that process along.
Yeah, I've had to do just the opposite. When I write the Scorpions, I have a couple of British friends, and they read it to make sure that I'm capturing how someone from England would say it, if you will.
Yes.
Although being from 1910, it's a little different then than now anyway. But
Yeah, yeah, you've got a whole extra level of
yeah,
complication, haven't you? Yeah,
true.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
talk to me about the Reacher movies versus TV show. Um, and I know Tom Cruise was an interesting casting choice. And I'm just wondering what your take is on the differences between the movie and the TV show.
yeah. No, that is a great question because it's something that a lot of people are really fascinated by, and I think look, the way it all developed was interesting because the how it works. If somebody's interested in in adapting your work either into a film or into TV, they buy what they call an option,
Right.
and Lee's stuff got optioned years ago, years and years and years ago, when there was no such thing as streaming TV. And it wouldn't be feasible to make a series out of a crime novel that had one episode a week, or, it wouldn't work. And so at that point, getting somebody interested in making a movie was the holy grail. Of adaptation anyway.
Right.
And so when the option was taken, it was wonderful. But like most things, nothing happened for a very, very long time. It kept getting, the option kept getting renewed and renewed and renewed, but nothing happened until finally the first of the Tom Cruise movies certainly became a live proposition. And one of the differences, as you probably know, between movies and TV is that with movies, to get a movie made, you have to have a star in order to bring the money.
Yes.
You can't have if it's going to be a big budget movie, you can't have an unknown actor in the lead role. And so, if you look at it from one perspective, what movie star is there who is as a you know as a is bigger than Tom Cruise? Really, there isn't anybody. He's been at the top of his game for decades,
Yep.
and so he had the clout. He could bring the money. He could make it happen, and so he did. And at the beginning, of course, a lot of people were fixated on the fact that he's not 6'5"
Right.
and he's not 250 pounds. And there's nothing we can do about that. He just isn't.
You're right.
Um, but and there was a degree of dissatisfaction, I think, with the movies in a lot of places, and people, I think, focused that on the size of the actor, which I think honestly was a little unfair because if you forget about the size and you just look at how Tom Cruise captured the character of Reacher, I think he actually did a really good job.
I agree.
There's a particular scene in the first movie. The first movie was based on one shot that involved a sniper apparently shooting people at random, and then when it was somebody, all of the evidence pointed to one person. When that person was arrested, he asked for Jack Reacher. So Jack Reacher arrives. So actually, very smart choice for the first movie because they knew that people would be worried about the size issue with Tom Cruise. And that book, that story, that is the one with the longest time before Reacher appears.
Ah,
Reacher doesn't actually show up in the story for a long time. So I think the idea was that anybody that went into the cinema with that on their minds, they'd be so drawn into the story by the time Reacher showed up that hopefully they'd have forgotten about all of that. So when Reacher he arrives, he starts investigating, and there's a scene where he's in a diner, unsurprisingly,
yeah, right.
sitting in the corner having his burger, and he just wants to be left alone. He's not looking for any trouble. But the bad guys need to engineer a situation where there's a fight so that they can have their heavies come in and beat him up. So they send in this woman to antagonize him so that he will respond to her and give them the opportunity to pile in. And just the way when he's just there in this corner of this booth, just really, in his face without even saying anything, you really get that look. I'm not looking for trouble, but if you start something, you know, he nailed it. And so, what I think the real issue, the real problem with the movies was how much time you have to play with on the screen. Because if you sort of cut the beginning, the sort of the intro, the exit stuff, you've basically got about 90 usable minutes for a movie. And what people, I mean, people love the fights and everything like that in the Reacher books, but what they will say more than anything is that what they love is to think along with Reacher, because Reacher is presented with a really, an apparently unsolvable problem. Like, no idea how this can be sorted out, and Reacher relentlessly unpeels layer after layer until he gets to the heart of the problem. And at that point, it's incredibly satisfying because it's kind of simultaneously a surprise, but also completely inevitable and the only way that it could be explained. And people find that incredibly satisfying. And it's only satisfying because of that process that you go through to get from the beginning where it's impossible to the end where it's solved. And you can't do that in a 90-minute movie.
Right.
So you wound up having scenes where that process was really, really rushed. So
Yeah.
the object that was lost was found too easily, the conclusion was reached too easily, and to me that made it feel almost cartoonish. It would be,
Right.
oh, I wonder who did this thing. Oh, it must be him. Oh, yes, it was. There was no satisfying detective work going on. And I think that was the biggest problem with the movie. And when you move to streaming television, all of a sudden you have all the time that you need.
Right.
You can have hours and hours, have like 8 hours to tell the
Yeah.
same story that you would have told in 90 minutes. And so it means that you can have that whole proper investigative process. You can have the thinking along with Reacher unfolding. And what you can also have is something that Lee and I always bang on about, which is that with thrillers, people are they're fixated on pace. They always say thrillers must be fast paced. There's always some blurb on the front about high octane or something like that, or roller coaster or whatever. And the thing is, we believe that if everything is fast, then actually nothing is fast. It's just all the same. You need to have some slow bits. You have to have the quieter bits. It's a look like a piece of music. It's no good if it's all at maximum volume. You
Yeah.
have to have some quieter, softer, slower, more introspective bits so that when the action suddenly explodes into life, it really hits you. It's not just something that you've become immune to because it's been like that from the beginning. And so you get to do that as well with the streaming TV. So I think that, combination of those things is really the format which lends itself. It gives you the opportunity because obviously there's still an awful lot that has to be done right. It has to be cast properly, and I think they did a brilliant job with that. It
Right.
has to be, the
Absolutely.
set, everything has to be right, the music, everything. And I think that they have done a phenomenal job. But the fact that it is that long format streaming is what gives it the opportunity to shine, which simply wasn't available for the movies.
Yeah. Do you have any desire to write one of the scripts?
Well, a couple of bits from a couple of the books that I've written, did show up on screen, and when I saw them, I hadn't really thought about doing it before because the way we were kind of playing it was that, over time we sort of might, it's evolved so that I'm really focusing on the books and Lee is focusing on the TV. But when I saw, those bits that I remembered writing those scenes, and I remember thinking, well, yeah, actually, maybe this would be really fun sometimes. So, I'm not ruling it out, but it's
Right.
it's not an immediate prospect, but something I think would be very fun if it ever became possible.
Cool. When do you start writing the next Reacher book, or are you writing it already?
Well, we're just wrapping up the one for this year, and so very shortly I'll be starting the one for 26.
You start on September 1st, isn't that correct?
That
Is
is correct.
it a
Yeah.
tradition of some nature?
Yeah, I mean it's a combination of two things from Lee. I mean, one is, and it kind of sums him up in a way because on the one hand, it is a really quite sentimental thing because he got fired from his job on the last day of August. One particular year, and so he went down to the stationery store, bought some paper, bought a pencil, and sat down to start writing the very next day, September the 1st. So that there's definitely that sentimental connection, but also it's a practical thing, right? If you're gonna publish a book a year, you have to write a book a year,
That's
and if you're
right.
gonna write a book a year, at a certain point, you have to start. And so, why not have that line in the sand that you stick to every year?
Well, cool.
Yeah.
So, just for the sake of time, because I don't think we can go much longer, I'm wondering what advice you might have for aspiring writers. And because based on both your Andrew Grant writing and your Andrew Child writing, I'm sure that people would be interested in hearing what advice you might have.
Well, thank you. And I mean, the advice I would give, it might not actually sound very helpful, but believe me, it is. My advice is ignore all advice because you have because the thing is, if you are starting out writing now, it's no good trying to write an Andrew Grant book or an Andrew Child book it doesn't work. You have to write your own book. And the fact is, you are the best person in the world at writing your book. No one else can do it. It has to be your book. It has to be your story. It has to be your voice. And the moment that you start trying to factor in information or advice from other people, all you're doing is you're diluting all of those things that make your book, that we're going to stop your book from being as strong as it can be. So ignore what anybody tells you. Write the book the way that you want to write it. Write it in a way that you will like it, and then hope that other people will like it. That's where it gets beyond your control because you don't know whether that'll be 10 people who like it, 1,000, a million, you don't know. But you just write a book that you hope some people will like. And I guess the only slightly more practical advice I would give, and this is something I remember struggling with quite a lot in the early days, is that you have to be very clear about what your job is in the whole process. Because I don't know if you found this or not, Rick, but you're writing, you have those little voices in the back of your head that are saying, oh no, this is no good, this is terrible, this is awful. No one, yeah, that's not your job. Deciding if the book is any good is not your job. Your job is to start on page one and to continue until you reach whatever the final page is. Just starting at the beginning, writing every single word until the end, not trying to decide, is this book any good? Not trying to decide what genre should it be, not trying to decide what kind of readers might or might not like it.
Right.
Those are things for other people. So what you have to do is be very clear about your job is to start at the beginning and keep writing till you reach the end, nothing else. And if you can remember that, it's easier said than done, but if you can remember that, it helps to insulate you from some of those nagging doubts. I mean, I remember a lot of, everybody knows about this book, Stephen King's book on writing, which is a wonderful, wonderful book. And there's a phrase, there's a couple of sentences in it that jumped out at me, just what hit me in the face when I first read that book, and I've never forgotten. And he said that he writes as quickly as possible because he needs to outrun the self-doubt.
That's a great line.
And I remember thinking, wow, if Stephen King needs to outrun the self-doubt, I don't need to feel quite so bad if I'm feeling the same way. And so just start at the beginning and don't stop till you get to the end and do not think about anything else.
Well, this has been absolutely a joy and lovely, and I appreciate your doing this. And I know people who see this are going to really enjoy what you have to say. Is there anything I should have asked you that I didn't?
Not at all. It's been an absolute pleasure, Rick. It's been wonderful getting to spend some time with you chatting about books. It's been wonderful. I just hope that you'll invite me back and that we can do it again sometime.
Absolutely. Be my pleasure. I appreciate
Excellent.
it. Thank you.